Well, welcome everyone. Once again, I'm Patrice Petro, director of the Carsey-Wolf Center, and I'm here with Rick Rosen, and we're here to discuss scenes from a marriage. We've talked about the questions that we want to address, but I thought we'd start because when Rick and I were talking about tonight's event, which we really wanted to focus on the status and future of global TV, he suggested let's do scenes from a marriage. Have you seen it? It's really quite great. And then it was about which episode, since there's 5 episodes, and it's hard to think. So initially we thought, well, we'll just go with the
pilot.
With a pilot, because it'll introduce you. But the pilot provides, some interesting information. But then Rick got back and said, no, we need to do the 4th episode. So I wondered if you'd just say a little bit about why you think the 4th episode is so important.
Well, first off, the pilot is very expositional. It just sort of sets up the series. There's not a great deal of drama in it. There's a piece of the pilot which deals with their best friends who are having marital problems. It's the last time you see them in the entire series. It's kind of not part of the show. And as Patrice laid out before we started to watch the show, each episode builds, the drama continues to build and build and build as you see this relationship which starts in what seems to be a very healthy place and ultimately disintegrates. And the 4th episode is by far the most powerful, emotional, and climactic. And interestingly, the 5th episode, the last episode, which follows this, is really a very soothing episode. Patrice and I have talked a little bit about this. You see these people come back together after they're divorced. There's a whole denouement about this episode. It's somewhat, in some ways reassuring, but it pulls the whole thing together in a place where you've been really ripped apart by this drama for 4 episodes, and this sort of puts it to bed in, I think, a very satisfying way.
Yeah, I agree. So you should watch the whole thing when you have a chance. Well, I'll turn to my first question, and I carefully worded these. Words matter, But Hagai Levi is one of the few Israeli creators who's done format adaptations like Tipul that gave rise to HBO's In Treatment. And he's also done original Israeli shows that have had international television distribution. With Scenes from a Marriage, he's working as a director and a writer on a U.S. set for a show that is itself a Scandinavian adaptation. Is Levi a special case, or is he at the forefront of a globalizing TV environment where creators move across roles, locations, and types of production?
It's a great question. I think he's both, quite frankly. Hagai, who is just an extraordinary talent, was the first person who brought an Israeli show to American television with In Treatment. As you say, it was the format of Tipul that became In Treatment. Before that, there had never been an Israeli show on American television or anywhere outside of Israel. And he became sort of the pioneer of that, and ultimately In Treatment begat a couple of Israeli comedies that begat Homeland, and then Fauda and Shtisel, and all this great, great Israeli drama that has, proliferated. But he was the pioneer. He was the first person on that. As far as Scenes from a Marriage, as I told you earlier tonight, it had a long gestation. It probably took 4 years or 5 years maybe to come to fruition. What happened was that maybe a year after the last season of In Treatment on HBO, Hagai got a cold call from Daniel Bergman, who was Ingmar Bergman's son, and said to him that the family, the Bergman family and the Bergman Foundation, had been contemplating for a while doing a contemporary remake of Scenes from a Marriage. Daniel, who is a director, thought about doing it himself, I think he was dissuaded by family members, but he wanted to direct it ultimately. But they all decided, they were such enormous fans of Entreatment and big sort of students of international television that they thought he would be the perfect person to try and adapt it, and would he be interested in doing it. It just so happens that Hagai, who grew up on a kibbutz, was obsessed with film. And when he was, I think, 17, I think he tells the story, I've heard him say it a few times, that, he watched the TV show Scenes from a Marriage, which, as I think everybody may know, was Bergman's only television show that he ever did. And he became obsessed with it. So he knew it very well. He was so enormously flattered by this invitation that he took them up on it and flew to Stockholm and met with Daniel and ultimately other members of the family and the foundation. And he thought about it, he really thought about it for a long time and agreed to do it. He had such a positive experience with HBO and doing Entreatment that he talked to them about it, and they just, of course, we'd love for you to do it. But it took a long time because he wrote it, and then when he delivered the first draft of the pilot, we all thought it was fantastic, and HBO loved it, and he didn't. And he threw it out. And then went on to do Our Boys, which is something else we can talk about in a minute, but came back to Scenes, and then had this revelation, and ultimately talked to Amy Herzog, playwright in New York, who he worked with on this a little bit, and he decided to do the gender reversal, right, where the spouse leaving the marriage would be the woman as opposed to the man, because in the original one that he wrote was very similar to Bergman's, where it was the man leaving, and he just thought it was more contemporary and it worked better, and HBO liked it more, and then he wrote this next script, and everyone just, they loved it. Yeah. So that's how
we'll be coming back to this question as we come through. But with the example of Scenes from a Marriage in mind, how do you see the TV market shifting in the wake of streaming and global production mergers? Have there been significant changes in the way we think about types of TV, adaptation, original format, or roles, creator, showrunner, writer, director?
Things have evolved so much, in, let's say, the last, I guess, Entreatment was probably 12, 13 years ago. Mm-hmm. At that time, what we used to do, and we still do sometimes, is we would take an Israeli show or a British show, or like in The Bridge, a Scandinavian show, and do an American version of it. Mm-hmm. And we still do, that's what Homeland was, and a lot of successful shows. But with the proliferation of streaming and the immense, almost insatiable need for more content, what started happening, and it initially was more of an economic thing, was that the streamers were buying what we call tapes. So they were buying the original versions of this show in their original language and trying them very inexpensively. And they found that it worked. Fauda was the perfect example of that. I remember seeing Fauda on a trip to Israel years ago, about, 6 months or a year before it came out. And I watched a couple of episodes, thought it was fantastic, and thought, how are we going to do an American version of this? Because Homeland at the time was massively successful, and in fact, the people that sold it wanted to do an American version of it. But ultimately, the distributors in Israel were able to sell it for a lot of money, and the original version. And so it went out in Hebrew, and it worked. It worked immensely, and it's a great show. And then you started seeing other things in their native languages that were doing the same thing. And, Our Boys was done that way. And then, Apple bought the Israeli show Tehran, which I don't know if anyone saw, is really actually a pretty good show. They're doing a second season of it. And in other, Squid Game now in, Korean, and Japanese shows. And, a former colleague of mine just produced this wonderful show on Apple called Pachinko. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's really, really a high quality drama in Korean. I think it's due to the fact that where we used to sell to an American network, now we're selling to a global audience. And so the ability to watch something in its native language is accepted more. And frankly, I think viewers have become a little bit more sophisticated and are not afraid of foreign languages, even on domestic networks. Before Our Boys was on in Hebrew, HBO did, My Brilliant Friend, right, in Italian. And so it's becoming more accepted.
Interesting. Well, as a follow-up, in recent years, Netflix famously declared that it no longer had a U.S. market as a central target audience, but was now interested in shows with a global appeal, like Squid Game. What are your thoughts about? Do you have further thoughts about this? I mean, you're just saying that.
Well, look, it's a complicated question. I mean, Netflix has a lot of issues right now. Obviously, if you've been reading the business of show business, right? Netflix said that because they've virtually reached full penetration in the United States, so they had to go outside the United States. Other American streamers haven't. I think that what I'm hearing from streamers, whether it's Apple or Amazon or Paramount Plus or Peacock or whatever these streamers might be, they just want something great and actually loud.
Yeah.
Because there's so much stuff out there that they have to cut through the clutter. And the only way to cut through it's hard to cut through the clutter with a soft, quiet show. I don't think you'd sell Scenes from a Marriage, frankly, to Peacock or Paramount Plus today. When I talk to the people at Peacock, which is owned by the company that produces movies like Fast and the Furious, give me something loud.
Yeah.
So I think it's this need to try to draw subscribers in.
Yeah. So let's return back to Scenes from a Marriage and Levy's work. Scenes from a Marriage is very much connected to his previous work, and not only In Treatment, but The Affair. All of these shows explore intimacy and feature characters in excruciating emotional pain. But all of the shows have a similar structure, where so much of the action is about people working through their relationships and increments across time. It seems that this is a kind of story that TV is getting really good at telling. And perhaps starting with Scenes from a Marriage exploration of intimacy and love, what are your thoughts on why these questions are so resonant with TV creators and audiences now? Or do you think that it isn't a presentist concern?
I think it depends on the creator, but I think these stories touch real human emotion, and they affect people at a very deep level. I think that sometimes these are very difficult shows to watch. At times, The Affair would get criticized, for being, because they tried to make it not as difficult to watch, and sometimes they got criticized for glossing over difficulties in marriages. But I think in particular, Hagai likes to explore human relationships, and he writes about emotion. The key is to do it in a way that you can maintain the audience. Scenes from a Marriage, it's very hard to watch like one episode or, and just sort of get a sense of this. As you and I have discussed, if you go through it in a linear basis, you feel the power of these relationships, the disintegration, and ultimately how these people feel about each other at the end. And not that, people are looking for satisfaction, but I think that it touches their emotion. True exploration of these relationships and the drama is something that I think resonates with everyone. So not everyone, but people who are willing to let themselves go there.
Right. Well, in that regard, I wondered what you thought about the show's practice of opening each episode by showing the actors and the crew in masks getting ready for the shoot. Of course, in some ways, it's a marker of the extraordinary times in which production took place, but various people have had different takes on it. Some critics really hated it. Other people wrote it as a kind of signaling this as a performance and as a reiteration of an already existing story. But I wondered what you thought of it.
Honestly, I didn't understand it in the beginning. And I didn't mention it to Hagai. But I talked to the producer about it, and I said, I just didn't understand it, right? And what was the point of it? And he thought it was a great technique. He liked it. It was important to Hagai and his vision of the show. I think it did reflect the time that they shot the show deep in the middle of COVID. They shut down twice. Everyone was so isolated, and it was a way of showing the isolation and then the coming together. It also was a theatrical device. I found it kind of interesting. But I will say at the end, at the end of episode 5, at the end of the series, if you watch the entire show, at the end of episode 5, which is, I think, a beautiful episode, what happens at the end when they walk off together, I think really ties it in really nicely. I think it really works.
Yeah, and it breaks the drop, but it is also an indication of these two actors' incredible friendship.
Well, that's exactly right, Patrice. And for people who don't know that, Oscar and Jessica went to Juilliard together. They knew each other for years and years. They live in New York near each other. They have children the same age. Their children have play dates together. These are people who are actually friends. And Jessica came late to this show. She wasn't initially cast in it. But it made the whole process easier because they knew each other. And so much of this show is obviously so emotional. It's so intimate. It's so sexual, that the fact that these were two people who were deeply knew each other for years and were close friends made the whole thing easier to do. At a time when and I've heard them talk about this in interviews where, this is difficult stuff to act. It's to do this for 10 hours a day, this type of drama, and each episode is 7-8 days. It's excruciatingly difficult to have someone as your partner in it who you do have a real bond with made it easier.
Yeah. Well, we've discussed that Levi flips the gender roles in the adaptation, as you said, and I'm just repeating, where the woman is the primary caretaker for the children in Bergman's series. It is now the father who takes on this role. The wife, moreover, is now the initial unfaithful partner. Levi's version of the show is multicultural. Jonathan is a Jew who's left an Orthodox Jewish community, and as an adjunct professor at Tufts, he teaches philosophy. That's why I love the first episode. Academics in the audience will love the fact that it sets up, she's the tech executive who makes big bucks, and he's the adjunct at Tufts who teaches philosophy. There's just something, in our world, that's a thing. But the couple that acts as his and Myra's foil in the first episode is now interracial and polyamorous. What do you think of the changes he made to the show to kind of update it?
I really liked it, and I thought it was really smart that he did it. As did HBO. They backed him 100% in his vision. I think it contemporizes it. I think it puts a real examination of gender roles in a real spotlight, which I think is really interesting. And I think it works. Now, internationally, the reviews are very mixed on this. Some people thought it was great. Some people didn't like it. And in fact, the show that premiered at the Venice Film Festival, and there was a lot of press junkets around, and really, I found bizarre. A lot of the European press gave Hagai and Jessica a hard time about this very issue. I mean, there were two interviewers one day that were saying to Jessica, how could you reconcile this character being a mother and walking out on a marriage? You know, she had a pretty strong reaction to the interview saying,
So
men have done this for you know, decades and years and centuries, and no one seems to have any issue with it. And she said, well, but she's moving to Tel Aviv, and she's going to come back, you know, once a month. And she said, you know, it happens all the time with men. So I thought it was I liked it. I thought it worked, and I thought it was a good exploration of gender roles.
It's interesting to me, as I told you when we were talking informally, that when I first watched it, because of course we thought we were going to do this in February or something,
Right.
And so when I watched it in December, at first I thought, my God, this guy is so wonderful and patient, and she's so difficult, and the moment when she tells him that she's fallen in love with someone else, and he says, we can go to therapy, we can fix this, and she said, I'm no longer attracted to you, how do you fix that? And these kind of really incredibly, and I thought, if it was me, get out. But anyways, watching it through, at first I thought, and I was reading critics who were saying that her role was not fully developed enough, and that this is really from a male point of view. But I have to say, on the second intense viewing of it more recently, I was struck by certain things that aren't said, but that are certainly understood. So that when, in the first episode, when it's a very wrenching decision, which I hope women will still be able to make, to get an abortion. She says it's a very complicated thing for her, but we learned that it was so hard with the first child, and that it took her 2 years to get back, and so there was some kind of postpartum depression. And she said, I just wanted to get back to my life and being me, which, as a mother myself, let me tell you, yes. So, and as the drama goes on, it's really about how, in some ways, I think the series is about how there's, all these normative ideals that you're supposed to want, and they've achieved it. They're in their 40s. She's not yet 40, but they have their child, and they have this, idyllic kind of house in a certain way. It's very, wonderful spaces, and they seem so caring for each other. But, as it goes on, it becomes clear that she didn't, being a mother was hard for her, that she never really wanted to be married, and that, her own mother suggested that you're not the type to get married. I'm not the type, it runs in our gene pool. And that they come to a place at the end, in the last episode, which is why I think it's so satisfying, where they accept who they are, where they've come, and what it means to love somebody over time.
In their way.
In their way, exactly. And that, in fact, and I was telling you too, one of the things in the last episode, all the men in her life, they all want children. And she's ambivalent about having children. But that's what both Polly, the young, dashing Israeli, and certainly Jonathan. So it's interesting that it's the men who want the children, and she is less interested.
It's really interesting, and I think it's in the 5th episode, as you say, where Mira talks about what her mother said to her about being married and their gene pool, and it just doesn't work. And I think that's really elucidating. In episode 1, I think it's episode 1, when they decide to have the abortion. It's either episode 1 or 2.
One.
Yeah. Jonathan is devastated. But he's doing it because this is what she wants, and he loves her.
Exactly.
But he's devastated by this decision. The question is whether she's doing it because she doesn't feel that she's fit to be a mom, or whether she's already in another relationship, or whether she doesn't know that she's capable of maintaining this relationship. There's a lot of unanswered questions. The best part, in my opinion, of episode 1 is that very powerful last scene, which is complicated. And obviously what happens when she gets the abortion, scars their relationship deeply, and it truly affects Jonathan. But again, jumping to the fifth, and I think we're probably ruining this for people who haven't yet seen it, but there is something so satisfying, and maybe I'm being a bit of a romantic about this, but I've seen all these episodes so many times, but at the end of episode 5, I believe that you see these people and they truly do love each other. They love each other deeply in their way. And they're not going to live together in all likelihood, although that remains open. But there's clearly something that is such a deep bond between them that is very, very powerful, that sort of says something also about marriage, right? Because these people do ultimately care for each other in a very deep, meaningful way.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking that at the end of the first episode with the abortion and how painful it is and how ambivalent he is, but he's a feminist husband. He's listening to her. He wants her to do what she feels right and understands it's her decision to make and wants to back her up. But then at the end of the episode 4 we just watched, it's the first time he becomes enraged, at her at the end. Well, just shifting gears. So Israeli creators have been at the forefront of format adaptation and originally, as you said earlier, and originally globally distributed television for well over a decade. The list is long, includes many titles and hits like Euphoria, for instance. In your view, is there a specific set of preoccupations or approaches to television storytelling that Israeli creators are distinct in telling?
So I've been asked this question about 500 times for about 15 years, ever since I started selling these Israeli shows. I think there's a glib answer, which I think has some truth to it, and I think there's a deeper answer. First of all, there's a very developed film and television industry there. Very, very talented. I mean, there's great playwrights and great theater and really great film and television for a long time. And I think when the world got smaller, first with the export of television, then with shows moving like In Treatment and other Fauda success, and things traveling, just people accepted Israel. I mean, sure, people were buying shows and formatting them from England, like All in the Family years ago, and millions of shows, but never Israel. And, I think that the more glib, facile answer is that, historically, Jews are great storytellers, and they have been historically. I think that's part of it. But as I say, there's a very rich and developed industry there with enormous talent, all of whom want to work here, right? But I think that's the truth. There's just really great storytellers there, and you're going to see a lot more of those shows. Listen, you see the actors are moving, the directors are moving. There's shows that you've seen you don't even realize come from Israeli directors and writers and movies, but it's a very rich industry there.
Yeah. Okay, well, my last question before we open up for audience questions, so I wanted to just, in preparing for this event, I consulted my former colleague, who is a television scholar, Tasha Oren, who I know many in the audience know. She's also an expert on Israeli TV, and she teaches at Tufts now. Although
know Jonathan?
No, she's in film and media, and she's not an adjunct.
Different department.
Different department. She told me and I was trying to verify this, and I've learned more since. But she wanted me to ask this, and she helped me a lot with thinking through questions. And she said that for most audiences outside of Sweden, Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage was known as a film made by a revered master of cinema at a moment when cinema itself was at the forefront of cultural life and ideas. So her question that she wanted me to pose to you is, what do you think about the role of so-called prestige TV now? How does it compare to the way that cinema was treated in the 70s. And I just want to just turn the screw one more notch to say, you know, Bergman himself considered Scenes from a Marriage a television film. You know, not the abridged version that got circulated,
Right.
but he saw his ambition was to make really quality television, like to make like the whole film television distinction. So I just wondered if you would want to remark on that.
Well, this, you know, obviously the 70s, I mean, I'm sure there are courses here about film in the 70s. That's when I was in school here. All right?
too.
I remember seeing Last Tango in Paris in IV at that theater right practically next to the campus. But, you know, we're in the golden age of television right now. I mean, there's so much great television, and there has been, frankly, for a long time. You know, it's probably been 7, 8 years of 10 years of great television. It just gets better and better. I mean, even longer. Look at The Wire on HBO. What's better than that? You know, or The Sopranos, but there's just been so much great television. You know, when I started in the industry, you know, to show you how things change. When I started in the industry, I would go into a colleague's office who was, you know, represented film writers, screenwriters, and I'd say, you know, does so-and-so want to do a television show? And they'd look at me like, he writes movies. Why would he want to do television, right? And get out of here, you know? And now, all they want to do is television, right? Because they get, in television, the writer is the king. And the writer is, you know, in charge, where in film, it's really the director. But there's also so much content. There's so many platforms where you can do really great work. And, you know, there's not an actor anywhere who won't do a television series right now, which 5 years ago, some would, but anybody, any actor will do, and any writer will do television or film. Also, as we've discussed a little bit, you know, the distinction between what is television and what is film with the streaming universe is very blurred. Mm-hmm. You know, Netflix is making, you know, 100 movies, you know, some of which are released theatrically, some aren't, and so you're getting auteurs like Scorsese and Spielberg who are doing movies for streamers. They think it's a film, similar to Bergman, right? So I think we're kind of back into that sort of same time. But, you know, we are definitely in a great era of television, and there's television for everyone. You know, there's the great, really, you know, these wonderful, wonderful shows that are on streaming. They're very, very powerful. You know, shows like this that are, you know, are not seen necessarily by massive audiences, but are really, really good. And then there's other types of television that get massive audiences, like my friend Dick Wolf, right? And all of his shows. God forbid we would be here on stage and not mention Dick, right? So there's, you know, there's just an enormous appetite, and I think the lines are really blurred between what is film and what is television, and it's evidenced by the people that I speak to, whether they be executives, whether they be major actors or writers. You know, great content is great wherever it's exhibited.
Right. Yeah, and here, it's just true.
But she's absolutely right about the 70s to today. It's a really great analogy.
Yeah.
This has been so great. Thank you so much for coming. I just could sit here all night and listen to you. And I just want to follow up.
Tell my wife, she's sitting to your right. She doesn't want to listen to me all night.
You're so lucky.
We'll have another Scenes from a Marriage afterwards.
Exactly.
I just want to follow up on exactly what you were talking about, the distinction between film and TV. We had Ezra Edelman here to talk about, a few years ago, to talk about the OJ, what I thought was a mini-series, right? And I said I was super psyched that it was he's bringing back the mini-series, and he said it was an 8-hour feature film. And so we had an interesting discussion around that. And so I've thought a lot, especially in TV classes, about this distinction. And I've thought a lot about what it means to talent or studios. But I am really interested in what it means at an agency, because you guys have TV divisions, right, and film divisions, but do you have content divisions? I mean, how do you deal with this when all the lines are so blurred?
You know, it really depends upon the creator's vision, right? So if the creator feels that it's a film, it's a film. Where it gets really hard to distinguish is with the proliferation of limited series, right? Because this show goes 5 episodes. You know, most limited series go about 8 or 10 episodes. Traditionally, the difference between film and television, when I would have these conversations with screenwriters and directors, would be that a movie has a beginning, middle, and end, but a television show continues. And so, without really until the end of the series, the ending, but it continues on. So if there's some finality to it, it's probably more of a film. But again, it's what the creator thinks, right? But if that person's vision, who came and talked to your class, it was exhibited, on FX, which is a linear television network, right? So I think John Landgraf, who runs FX, would say, you can call it whatever you want. It was a great piece of work. It was great artistic vision, and I don't care what we call it. Now, it'll be nominated for an Emmy and not an Oscar, so that may be disappointing to that person. But it was Ryan Murphy and that whole group did a great job on it. It was a great show.
Hi, yes, I have a question. So in a lot of communication classes that I've taken, we've talked a lot about just like cultural differences, and I know that global TV you're dealing with the globe, so of course there's going to be, I guess, cultural differences. So how do you deal with those and incorporate those into a lot of the productions that you guys deal with?
Well, there's an enormous need for diversity in sort of what you would call cultural television, right? There is, a massive appetite to try to get diversity of everywhere, from behind the camera to in front of the camera, to stories about different types of cultures. So it's enormously important, and I think the industry has made some strides, but not enough. And I know from our agency, and I'm sure others, but we're trying to do whatever we can to bring more diverse people into our workforce from the bottom up, because we need representatives who understand different cultures and different types of voices, so that they can represent that type of talent, bring in that type of talent, because that's what America looks like. And that's what's going to sell and be appealing, are those types of shows from different types of communities.
Does the streaming model change the profit motive for the creators? Is there a different
I'm sorry, say that again.
profit motive for streaming? Does that change the
That's a whole class, okay? The answer is yes, in a major way. And that's one of the most fundamental differences in television today compared to a few years ago. Changed massively. The days of, a show like when Marcy made The Cosby Show and it was syndicated to local television stations around the country and got huge ratings, and enormous profits to studios. That's how television business worked for years and years and years, until pretty recently. Now, because of the proliferation of streamers, and local stations aren't buying reruns of shows very much, very little. And so streamers are, this is a really short answer to a long, complicated question, but streamers are buying some library, what I would call library product, but not a lot, and not for a lot of money, and not exclusively. You know, they'll buy, but they'll let other people buy it, which never happened before. So what's happening now for the creators is that we have to work models where they get paid perhaps less in big success, but they also get paid something in failure. So, you know, and in success, what we do is we make really big deals for them on their next project, which makes up for, you know, perhaps less of the profits that exist down the end. I hope that explains it, but that's like the paragraph in the syllabus about what the course is about.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining us.
Can I
Please
just
join-
give a plug about Hagai about one thing?
Yes,
okay?
please.
Because I feel very strongly about this person, as my wife knows. So if you watch Scenes from Marriage, I urge you to watch 1 through 5 because you get a real sense of what that show is. But he made a show for HBO a few years ago called Our Boys, which is an extraordinary piece of work in my opinion. And it's a show about a true story, actually, about in 2014 when these 3 Israeli boys were abducted by some Hamas terrorists and murdered. And in retaliation, ultra-religious people kidnapped and burned to death an innocent Palestinian teenager. And there was a manhunt, and they found the killers of this Palestinian boy. And there was a trial where this person was convicted and sentenced to a life sentence. These 2 people. So this is a show that is a different way of doing a procedural drama, like the stuff that Dick does so well. It's a story about hate crimes. This is not a political story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a story about hate crimes and the effect of hate crimes on families, the Palestinian family and the Israeli family, and the commonality that these people have. So Hagai wanted to do this. Actually, it was HBO's idea. They saw an article in the New York Times. They brought it to him. He wrote this show, and it's in Hebrew and Arabic, and it was put on HBO kind of in the middle of the week, late at night, because it wasn't going to be a Sunday night at 9 o'clock HBO show. But it's an incredible series, and something that I think is, it's just brilliant. So maybe someone should, you should watch it or
Bring it to
put
the
into a class or something like that, because it's something that he's done that I think is extraordinary. That everyone knows about In Treatment and The Affair and Scenes, but this is a very small, very intimate, very powerful show. It's really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Rick Rosen.